In 1985, viewers of NBC's Today were introduced to an older man with two names. For years, friends and colleagues had known him as Dennis Wiles. They knew a man who taught skiing near Lake Tahoe, worked in construction, played tennis professionally, married, and helped raise a family. But Dennis Wiles had not been born Dennis Wiles. His real name was Georg Gärtner. He had entered the United States during the Second World War as a German prisoner. Then, on September 21, 1945, he escaped from a camp in New Mexico, climbed aboard a freight train, and disappeared into America. He remained there for almost 40 years. This was not a man sealed inside a basement or hiding in a remote cabin. He worked in public. He made friends. He married. He moved from place to place and built an ordinary life in the same country whose military had once guarded him. By 1985, newspapers were calling Gärtner the last known escaped German prisoner of war still missing in the United States. His public appearance on television revealed the secret. His formal surrender would happen separately, with immigration officials in San Pedro, California. The escape is only the beginning of the mystery. The harder questions are how he lived so visibly afterward, and why a prisoner who had survived the war waited until the war was over before he ran. I am Samuel Hartman. My father was one of the German prisoners brought to America. That connection is why I return to this part of history. More than 425,000 prisoners of war were held in the United States during the Second World War, most of them German. They passed through hundreds of camps and branch camps. Their experiences were not identical, but nearly all of those stories eventually turned toward the same expectation. The prisoners would be sent home. The size of that system can make its prisoners look interchangeable. They were not. Each man carried a different hometown, military record, set of loyalties, and idea of what home would mean after defeat. The system could place thousands of men on the same path across the Atlantic. It could not make the destination waiting for each of them the same. Gärtner's story turned in the opposite direction. He had not crossed the Atlantic intending to become an American. He did not arrive as an immigrant, and he did not choose the country that held him. Yet when repatriation approached, he decided that returning home was more dangerous than becoming a fugitive in a place where he barely belonged. To understand that decision, we have to begin with the home he expected to find again. Georg Gärtner was born in Schweidnitz, in the German region of Silesia. The city is now called Świdnica and lies in Poland, but that was not the map of his youth. When he emerged in 1985, Gärtner said he had joined the German army in 1940, when he was 19. He served in North Africa under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Eventually, he was captured and transported across the Atlantic to the United States. This movement of prisoners was enormous. The United States had space, food, railways, and labor needs. German and Italian prisoners were distributed through a network that reached far beyond the large base camps. Many Americans who never went near a battlefield encountered prisoners on farms, in work details, or in towns close to a camp. For Gärtner, capture had therefore produced a strange kind of distance. He had left Silesia as a young soldier, fought in North Africa, and ended up behind wire in the American Southwest. Every stage moved him farther from the political changes taking place around his birthplace. The place he remembered and the place he might be returned to were beginning to separate. Gärtner was held at Fort Deming in New Mexico, also called Camp Deming in later accounts. He worked there as a translator. That job matters. A translator lives between languages. He hears orders, questions, rumors, and explanations before many other prisoners do. It does not mean he possessed perfect information, but he was not entirely cut off from news beyond the fences. While the fighting continued, escape offered little. The desert opened onto an unfamiliar country where he spoke imperfect English, had no legal identity, and had no certain route home. Waiting made more sense, until it did not. By 1945, Germany was defeated. For prisoners in America, the end of the fighting did not bring immediate release. Camps still operated while governments decided how and when to return men across the Atlantic. That interval is easy to flatten when we tell the story backward. We know the war had ended. A prisoner behind wire did not know exactly what waited at the other end of repatriation. News arrived in pieces, mixed with rumor and personal fear. Gärtner's destination was no longer politically simple. Schweidnitz stood in Silesia, a region caught in the vast territorial settlement that followed Nazi Germany's collapse. At the Potsdam Conference, the former German territories east of the Oder and Neisse rivers were placed under Polish administration, pending a final peace settlement. Poland itself had shifted west, while Soviet power dominated the region. On a map, that can look like a border moving across paper. For the people who lived there, it meant disrupted homes, new authorities, mass displacement, and uncertainty about who could remain. The name of Gärtner's hometown reflected the change. Schweidnitz had been a German city. Under Polish administration, it became Świdnica. A returning prisoner would find a civic world different from the one he had left in 1940. The state, the authorities, and the future of the German population in the region had all changed while he was absent. Gärtner later said that this change frightened him. He believed returning to his hometown would place him under Soviet power, and he feared what might happen to him as a former German soldier. The political change around Silesia was real. What it meant to Gärtner came from his own judgment. Years later, he said it convinced him that returning home would place him under Soviet power. The war ending had removed one danger and created another. If he stayed obediently in the camp, the system might deliver him to the place he now feared. If he escaped, he would be alone in the United States, wanted and without papers. But he could at least choose the direction of travel. That was the reversal at the center of his life. Freedom did not mean going home. For him, freedom meant refusing to go there. On September 21, 1945, Gärtner made his choice. Years later, Gärtner described getting beneath the camp barriers, avoiding the guards, and reaching a Southern Pacific freight train. He climbed into a boxcar bound west. The route was remarkably simple. A barrier, a gap in observation, and a freight car were enough to move him beyond the immediate search area. The train carried him to San Pedro on the California coast. That destination mattered. A local search around Deming had to find a man who was already being carried across several states. He did not need to defeat every search effort. He needed the freight network to move him beyond the place where guards knew whom they were looking for. By the time the boxcar reached California, the camp had lost its strongest advantage, a small area in which one missing prisoner stood out. That first journey solved only the first problem. Gärtner was outside the camp, but he had no safe legal place in American life. He needed food, work, language, and a name that could survive a question from an employer or a police officer. An attorney-released biography described his first year as a period of constant movement along the West Coast. It said he worked as a dishwasher, a lumberjack, and a migrant laborer. These were jobs in which a man might arrive, work, and move on without leaving a long biography behind him. He moved at least 20 times and used several aliases. Movement gave him distance, but it could not give him permanence. For that he needed a usable identity. At first, moving was itself a form of protection. A short job did not require a long past. A new town did not know which questions the last town had asked. Yet constant movement also kept him vulnerable. If he became ill, lost work, or attracted official attention, there was no secure history behind the name he was using. A fugitive can survive by leaving. A settled adult has to learn how to stay. Gärtner improved his English and obtained a Social Security card in the name Dennis Wiles. The card gave his new identity the practical weight that an alias alone could not provide. What matters is what the name allowed him to do. Dennis Wiles could apply for work. He could be introduced to someone without every conversation becoming an interrogation. He could rent a room, earn money, and make plans that extended beyond the next train out of town. Near Lake Tahoe, he worked as a ski instructor. During warmer months, he took jobs in construction and sales. He also worked as a tennis professional and later as a construction estimator or architectural consultant. Those occupations sharpened the strangest part of his disappearance. He was not always doing anonymous work at the edge of society. Teaching skiing and tennis requires clients. Construction work requires colleagues, schedules, and trust. An estimator has to discuss costs and plans. The fugitive became easier to see at the same time that his original identity became harder to find. Gärtner did not spend 40 years physically hidden. Georg Gärtner was concealed inside the public life of Dennis Wiles. Post-war America made that possible in ways that would be much harder now. Records were local and often disconnected. There was no national digital trail joining each new address, workplace, and acquaintance. A man who spoke English, carried a working name, and moved when necessary could place distance between one version of himself and the next. This was not an unbroken 40-year manhunt. Immigration officials said the FBI warrant for his escape had been canceled in 1976. Different agencies had different questions to answer, and active pursuit did not remain unchanged from 1945 to 1985. That makes his long concealment less cinematic but more revealing. By 1985, this was no longer a chase with officers one step behind him. Ordinary life had offered places where the past was rarely demanded in full. Each move reduced the number of people who could compare the man in front of them with the fragments he left behind. Each new job gave Dennis Wiles more history. Year after year, the borrowed identity accumulated genuine experience. Wages earned, skills learned, friendships made. Time helped in another way. In 1945, officials would have been looking for a 24-year-old German soldier who had just left a POW camp. 10 or 20 years later, the person they would need to recognize had aged, changed occupations, and acquired an American life that looked normal to the people around him. The original description grew older on paper while the living man kept changing. The name may have been false, but much of the life attached to it was real. By the time Gärtner settled into more stable work, the habits that had protected him also limited him. He could participate in American life, but he could not explain its beginning. He could tell people what he did yesterday more easily than where he had been as a young man. Ordinary questions about parents, military service, passports, and travel carried a risk that his friends could not see. He also had to live with a practical contradiction. The more convincing Dennis Wiles became, the more he had to protect the identity. Stability gave him something to lose. He lived in several states and built a respectable professional life. None of that erased the event at Deming. It simply placed decades between the escape and anyone trying to judge it. By 1985, newspapers described him as the last remaining or last known escaped German POW in the country. The phrase captured the remarkable position he occupied. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners had entered the American system. Repatriations had ended, camps had disappeared, and a new generation had grown up. One name from that system still had no official ending. For Dennis Wiles, meanwhile, life had become deeply personal. Gärtner met Jean Clark at a YMCA dance. They married in 1964, and he became part of a family that included her 2 children from an earlier marriage. Jean knew him as Dennis. For most of their marriage, she did not know that her husband was Georg Gärtner, or that he had entered America as a prisoner of war. His refusal to explain his past became a serious strain. A hidden identity is kept every time a reasonable question cannot receive a full answer. That kind of silence changes as a relationship deepens. An acquaintance may accept a vague answer about childhood. A spouse encounters the blank spaces repeatedly. When documents are needed, when relatives are discussed, when a journey crosses a border, or when the family tries to understand why one subject can never be opened. The secret was no longer protecting only Gärtner. It was shaping Jean's life without her consent. Travel was difficult. Family history was a closed door. Jean could share the present with her husband, but not the events that had shaped him before they met. Gärtner later remembered the marriage reaching a point at which Jean was prepared to leave. Her bags were packed and transportation was waiting. Only then did he tell her who he was. That confession did not immediately place him in front of officials. It did change the problem. Until then, disclosure had threatened the life he had built. Now, continued silence threatened it as well. Jean urged him to surrender. Gärtner still needed a way to tell a 40-year story that would not be reduced to a single word: escapee. He found that route through a historian. Gärtner had read a book about German prisoners in America by Arnold Kramer. He contacted Kramer and revealed who he was. Kramer later told reporters that he agreed to help write Gärtner's story on one important condition. After the book appeared, Gärtner would give himself up. The resulting memoir, Hitler's Last Soldier in America, was published in 1985 by Stein and Day, credited to Georg Gärtner with Arnold Kramer. The publisher acknowledged that the surrender was timed with the release of the book. The timing was deliberate. Confession, publication, and surrender had been connected from the moment Kramer agreed to help him. The arrangement gave Gärtner something he had never possessed as Dennis Wiles: a public account of how the 2 names belonged to one life. It also let him place the escape inside its historical setting before the legal system reduced it to a file. Readers could encounter the changed borders, his stated fear of repatriation, the boxcar, the years of work, and the marriage before deciding what one act in 1945 should mean in 1985. That was an advantage, but it came with the condition Kramer had set. Publication could explain the secret only if Gärtner was prepared to stop keeping it. It also removed the last protection. Once the story appeared, officials no longer had to find him. He was walking toward them. On September 11, 1985, Georg Gärtner formally surrendered to officials of the Immigration and Naturalization Service in San Pedro. He was released almost immediately while the case was referred to the agency's Denver office. No pardon was granted. Officials instead faced several separate questions. What wartime offense could still be pursued? What had happened to the old warrant? What was his immigration status after 4 decades under another name? Which agency had authority over which part of the case? The INS said the FBI warrant had been canceled in 1976. Immigration officials initially described Gärtner as deportable, but they also said his marriage to an American citizen gave him a route to seek lawful permanent residence. Officials at the time considered prosecution or deportation unlikely or avoidable. Those statements answered different questions. Canceling an FBI warrant concerned the old effort to arrest him for the escape. Immigration status concerned whether he had a legal right to remain in the country. Possible prosecution concerned whether authorities would try to bring a viable case after 4 decades. One favorable answer did not automatically settle the others, which is why describing the outcome as government forgiveness would be misleading. Authorities still had the escape and false identity in front of them. The immediate outcome was narrow. Gärtner surrendered, was not put in jail, and entered an immigration process instead of receiving the dramatic punishment many viewers expected. The same country that had once confined him now had to decide what to do with a man whose entire adult life had unfolded inside it. For almost 40 years, Dennis Wiles had been the name that allowed Georg Gärtner to work, marry, and remain in America. In 1985, speaking his original name publicly ended the concealment, even though it did not answer every moral question about the life built beneath the other one. His story began with a changed map. It continued because post-war America allowed movement, work, and reinvention without a single system joining every record. It ended when the cost of hiding entered his marriage and became greater than the danger of being known. Which story from the war years would you like me to tell next? Tell me in the comments. If you would like to hear more of these histories, please like the video and subscribe. Georg Gärtner escaped a prison camp in one name. 40 years later, he chose to answer for that escape in his own.